By training, I am biodiversity specialist / ecologist, but my experience so far has been within the investment sector before joining UNEP-WCMC, where I mostly work with the oil and gas industry, both from the private sector perspective, but also with government stakeholders, and how to implement procedures and policies that support environmental management, sound environmental management of the oil and gas industries. And that's in particular in Africa as well as in Southeast Asia. So today we're going to focus on the leverage points for engaging with the private sector. And if you think back of all the different sessions you've had so far, there are many different pressures, factors, and drivers which can influence how and why biodiversity would be managed by the private sector. And for example, the global momentum and the national legislation and policy setting, which you discussed as part of the session on the 29th of May, is one of them, but also the role of lenders and other financial institutions at large, especially for development corridors, which you discussed on the 12th of June, and the structure of the EIA and SEA legislation, which you discussed on 19th of June. So this is content that you have somewhat covered in the past, and we're going to go back to it today to really look at it under the lens of how can you influence the private sector, how are those driving change within the private sector, driving change within their practices, and where are opportunities for you as a result, as researchers, to really feed it in those drivers and maximize the impact of your research on the private sector and general corporate biodiversity management. So just the agenda for today, we're going to start off with a session on the drivers and incentives for companies to change their practices. It will be a presentation for about half an hour or so, and then we will open up to Q&A. And we'll also have guided discussions around the questions that Amaya sent to you yesterday, just to hear some of your input, what's been your experience with the private sector so far, what have you found has worked or not, and really open up to any questions you might have for us. And after the break from 10 to 10:30, we'll have a session on how to make research business relevant, really looking at what are the keywords to use, what's the language, what are the stakeholders you need to contact within a company to really enhance the impact of your research. And again, we'll have a very open discussion afterwards to really hear from your experience and exchange on what works, what doesn't work, or what is important to keep in mind. And we'll aim to finish at 11:30 as per your other trainings. Okay, so session number one, what are the drivers and incentives for companies to change their practices? So the first slide I showed you had multiple different arrows of potential drivers feeding into corporate biodiversity management. But here we're really going to focus on three of them in particular. How national legislation will influence a company's policies, how lenders and industry practices have trickled down to company processes, and finally looking at global initiatives which are driving corporate commitments at large. So those will be the three main points I will try to make. So starting off with requirements from national legislation. Impact assessment legislation acts as a key driver to a company's practices. And although the EIA process, which you can see here on the right-hand side of this slide, this is a diagram pulled from a publication by UNEP in 2018 on assessing environmental impacts and a review of the legislation around the world for EIAs and SEAs. And there really is this common process that most countries will follow. However, despite all those commonalities, the exact process will be mandated by a country's legislation. And this will have repercussions for a company which is looking to operate within that country, which is looking to build a development corridor within a country, for example. And in order to secure approval for its projects for that corridor, the company will need to make sure it abides by all the different requirements specific to that country, and therefore has the processes and the staff in place to meet those. It's also worth noting that a lot of large infrastructure companies may be active in various countries. There might be not just a national company, there might be having projects across a range of countries, which means that they will need to accommodate more than one type of legislation. That might mean that they have different processes in each country, but they might also decide to adopt a company-wide policy that will somehow meet all those different requirements. For example, in terms of differences within legislation, at least in 2018, China did not require an assessment of cumulative impact in its EIA laws, which this is a requirement for projects in Kenya and Tanzania. So a company that used to operate in China, if it was to come and operate in Kenya or Tanzania, would need to make sure that its processes include the consideration of cumulative impacts between its projects and other projects in the area before submitting an EIA report to a competent authority. Looking at other specific steps within the EIA process, screening is one that is applied very differently across countries. So EIA screening determines whether or not a project should be subject to an EIA and to what extent of detail. And for example, in the case of Kenya, the legislation provides a list of projects which will require EIAs. So if you have a project, you will go check that list, see if yours fall under category A, B, or C, and you will know what kind of EIA you need to do. However, in Tanzania, they use screening criteria instead, which means that you will have to look at the specificities attached with your project and check whether or not those meet any of those criteria, and as a result, see if you need an EIA and to what extent of detail. And this is going to be different across countries. Each country will have its own approach to screening. Another point is that, for example, both Kenya and Tanzania require by law the involvement of an environmental practitioner of a certain experience already at the screening stage. This means that, again, a company will need to have the processes, in particular the staff, in place to meet that requirement. It means that at the screening stage, it needs to have the capacity internally to have an environmental practitioner to say, this is a project that has those specific risks, this is a project that will have those specific environmental impacts, etc. Another key element of the EIA process that I want to draw your attention to is public participation, because once again, this is something that's going to be applied very differently across countries. So public participation can happen across the EIA process and can happen at screening, scoping, impact analysis, or even at the final EIA decision stage. And it will be under very different formats. You could have public meetings, you could have publication of information within newspapers, within boards, within local communities, etc. And ideally, public participation should not be just restricted to informing affected communities of what's going to happen and how is that going to impact them. This is very much the bare minimum. What you, in best practice, should look to do is to meaningfully engage with stakeholders to have a better understanding of the real impact of your project on both the environment and on communities, and for those communities to influence the design of the project and ultimately even influence the outcome of the EIA decision by the competent authority, by the government institution that is going to say, yes, this EIA is approved or not. You would want to have had enough public participation ahead of time that they understand whether or not the trade-off in terms of environmental and social impacts and general economic development is worth it. Now, some countries will only require limited information to be published. For example, you will only have the non-technical summary of an EIA report, which will be published, or you will only know the final decision of the competent authority as to whether or not an EIA has been approved. But other will require more substantial information. For example, you could ask for the full EIA report to be published and available to anyone. Or you could require for competent authorities to provide justification as to why they made that decision, why they approved this project, or why they denied this project its environmental permit. You could also have requirements in terms of the number of public forums that need to be organized. For example, Kenya requires public participation from the scoping stage, so quite early on in the process, and specifies even how many meetings must be held. There must be at least 3 public meetings with affected communities and concerned parties. And once again, all the specificities of the national legislation will really drive what a company does and plans for as part of the EIA process. And it's important to note that all of those are specific stages, specific processes that need to happen to really showcase the quality of the assessment. A company is trying to showcase that it has done its due diligence, it has carried out an EIA to the standards required by the country to then gain approval of its EIA to carry on with its project. But the competent authority is not just going to look at the quality of the EIA, it's also going to look at the capacity of the company to really implement what it says it will in its EIA report. The company says, we realize there are those impacts, but we'll implement those mitigation measures to really compensate for those impacts, and as a result, there will be no impact on the environment. Whether or not that company has the governance, the capacity, the resources to implement those mitigation measures will be assessed by a competent authority before it grants it its approval for a project. And so that's something else that a company will really strive to prove during the EIA process. It's also important to note that impact assessment legislation is not the only piece of legislation which can influence the practices adopted by a company. And there are other laws and commitments from a country which can trickle down to impact assessments practices. And for example, in 2016, the Kenya Climate Change Act made it mandatory for climate risk and vulnerability assessment to be integrated within any impact, any forms of assessment. And so that's something that now is visible or should be visible within EIAs because of this particular piece of legislation. So moving on to practices from the financial industry and industry standards at large. The financial sector and also just industry associations have very heavily influenced how large-scale infrastructure companies, so for development corridors, how those companies operate. In particular, they have influenced that through their standards and through their guidance. And here I've just included 3 examples of important guidance documents that have really driven practices in terms of biodiversity management for the private sector. So on the right-hand side, you see the cross-sector guide for implementing the mitigation hierarchy, which was published by the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative. And that is really a go-to resource for a lot of the private sector as to how they're going to implement the mitigation hierarchy. And the other 2 on the left are publications that were commissioned by a group of multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and IFC, again, on how biodiversity is integrated within impact assessment processes. So as you'll recall from John Hobbs' introduction to the landscape of financial actors, there are many multilateral and regional institutions which are financing development corridors. Some of them are displayed on this slide. Some of them have been particularly active in terms of driving standards and practices across the infrastructure sector. And here in particular, I'm thinking of the World Bank, which is for public funds, and IFC, its arm for the private funds. A lot of the actors outlined here are public, but of course there are also private actors involved. There are private banks which are financing some of those development corridors. I just haven't displayed them on the slide. And similarly, there are also certain industries which have developed very strong platforms to advocate for certain best practices. To note is the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative, which I've just mentioned with its publication, and that's a partnership between multiple organizations, including IPICA, which is the Oil and Gas Industry Association, ICMM, which is the Mining Industry Association, and the Equator Principles Association, which represents a whole group of financial institutions. And I will go back to those 3 in a bit more details in just a bit, but just to say that you have both those public financial institutions driving change, but also industry associations. So what kind of change are they really driving in terms of corporate practices? So there are 3 key elements that come out. It's risk-based approach, the mitigation hierarchy, and priority areas. A risk-based approach focuses on taking actions in proportion to the risk associated with the specific project. So it acknowledges that the requirements from EIA legislation may not be sufficient, that a one-size-fits-all approach is not the best. Every project will have its own specificities, every location will have its own specificities, and this is why you should have the processes in place to really cater for all those different specificities. And in order to align with this approach, this is where the mitigation hierarchy really ensures that the right measures are implemented in the right order so as to meet no net loss of biodiversity or even perhaps net gain of biodiversity. I think you will have heard about the mitigation hierarchy and no net loss of biodiversity previously from Diego, but I'm going to go back to this in just a second. But before that, I wanted to cover priority areas. Those are identified as areas with specific biodiversity importance, which will justify additional action to ensure conservation of their value. This is where financial institutions and the industry will recognize that those areas are particularly important for biodiversity and they need specific attention. In some of the well-known standards, they are referred to as critical habitats. And so priority areas or critical habitats will be used interchangeably by certain actors. And so one of the financial standards I'm thinking of in particular is IFC Performance Standard 6, IFCPS 6. This was set out in 2012, and it's really developed into a widely recognized standard of international good practice for mainstreaming and managing impacts on biodiversity. It is the reference for the private sector when it comes to how to manage biodiversity, IFCPS 6. In order to access financing from IFC, companies need to show that their project is in line with the requirements set out in this standard in IFCPS 6. And that includes if those requirements go above and beyond what is required in the national legislation. It's not enough to show that you comply with all the requirements from the legislation in the country you operate within. You also need to prove to IFC that you will meet their specific requirements, at least if you want to access funds from them. I say from them, but actually IFCPS 6 is not just relevant for IFC funds. The World Bank Environmental and Social Framework is aligned with the IFC performance standards, which means that if you want to access money from IFC or from World Bank, you're going to have to look at those requirements. And in fact, the Equator Principles financial institutions, which I just mentioned before, have adopted IFCPS 6 as a requirement as well. And at the moment, the Equator Principles financial institutions are a total of 101 financial institutions in 38 countries. And that really gives you an idea of the scale of influence that single standard can have on the industry, on infrastructure, especially large-scale infrastructure. Because most of the financial institutions you will turn to will use that as their way of assessing whether or not a company has addressed biodiversity risk and consideration within its project. So going back to the mitigation hierarchy, this is a fundamental process to managing biodiversity throughout the life cycle of a project. And it's strongly advocated by financial and industry standards. So mitigation hierarchy is referred to, for example, in IFCPS 6. And the idea is that prior to a project, an area would have a specific biodiversity value, which would be there at the top of this graph, next to the plus, you have X amount of biodiversity. And the project is going to impact upon that and bring that biodiversity down. Now, by applying measures to first avoid, then minimize, and finally restore some of those impacts, you will only have residual impact. And that's where the last stage of the mitigation hierarchy comes in, which is to offset those residual impacts in the hope of reaching at least no net loss of biodiversity, or you could even have a net gain of biodiversity. So no net loss has been defined as the point where biodiversity gains from target conservation activities match the losses of biodiversity which are due to the impact of a specific development project, so that there is no net reduction overall in the type, in the amount, and in the condition of biodiversity over space and time. And that's a definition that was provided by BBOP, which is the Business and Biodiversity Offset Programme. They have published a whole range of documentation on the mitigation hierarchy and on offsets in particular and compensation. And so if you're interested in those topics, I would really recommend going and reading some of those documents, because again, this is one of the key source of information that the private sector often tends to turn to when it wants to understand the risk associated with biodiversity for their projects. Now, the order in which those mitigation measures are considered is particularly important. It's avoiding, minimizing, restoring, and offsetting. And as part of the official EIA process, at least in most legislation, project alternatives are meant to be considered. You are meant to look as to the different routes of a development corridors and what are the impacts associated with each of those routes, so as to when you decide on your final route, you have taken into consideration the environmental impacts associated with each of them. However, there are often other constraints which will decide which route needs to be picked. It might be linked to the fact that it will have social impacts as well. It might be linked to cost considerations and even political considerations. And so there are so many different factors. The environmental one isn't always very much taken into account. But when you apply the mitigation hierarchy, you have a second chance at looking at project alternatives. Because by prioritizing avoidance of impact, you're going to have to look back at your project design and really ensure the route, the location of the corridor of any associated facilities, the design, and also even the construction schedule, when construction is going to take place, during which hours of the day, during which month of the year. This is again a chance of avoiding impacts on the environment. And so making sure you take that into consideration before you start thinking, I'm going to have an impact, I'll just compensate at the end. No, you should, a company, and this is where financial actors and industry associations are really trying to push a company to look at it in the right order as a hierarchy. And so some companies have adopted the mitigation hierarchy within their internal policies, have adopted no net loss practices, and some of them even have decided to make commitments in that regard, have committed to ensure no net loss in all their projects, not just for some of them or for the ones with the largest environmental impact. Which brings me to the final point on commitments, which is linked to global initiatives and agreement. The global environmental agenda is a key driver to the private sector's interests and practices. And that includes multilateral environmental agreements, which you discussed on the session on the 29th with Daniela and Jerry. Some of the key agreements that have really driven change within the private sector have been the Sustainable Development Goals, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and in particular with the run-up to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, there's been a lot of interest from the private sector to understand what are the expected commitments, expected goals that would come out from this new framework. And then, of course, the UNEP-WCMC with the Paris Agreement. A lot of companies have been a lot more committed, or at least it would seem so, in terms of climate action and climate commitments versus biodiversity. And that might be because climate has had a lot more of publicity is not the right word, but has been disseminated in general practices, has had commitments from even countries, from political agencies, and that has been reflected within the private sector. And a lot of companies have made a commitment to be Paris aligned. Their activities will feed into the general efforts of the world to meet the requirements from the Paris Agreement. And the hope, of course, is that a similar pattern will occur with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, that companies will also try to make commitments to feed into this new biodiversity framework, which aims to prevent the loss of biodiversity and even restore biodiversity and ecosystems. And it's important to note that those large-scale agreements also influence national approaches, because, for example, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans stemming from the requirements from the Convention on Biological Diversity can then have impacts within national policies, which again will feed into private sector policies. The CBD in particular has realized the importance of the private sector to feed into its goals, and it has a mainstreaming agenda, which has set specific decisions related to the infrastructure sector, calling, amongst other things, for strengthened EIA and SEA legislation. So although it might be easy to think that the CBD will focus on environmental legislation or biodiversity legislation only, through its mainstreaming efforts, it is really trying to impact a wider range of legislation and policies that will drive change within the private sector and within the infrastructure in particular. So front-runner companies within the private sector are really looking to engage with those global initiatives for biodiversity. And some are even starting to make commitments which can have repercussions on their activities and their practices. So the engagement can be done through the industry association. As I mentioned, those are quite strong for certain industries, and they are the ones that ultimately will influence wider change among a wider range of companies. So I've mentioned before IPECA, which is the oil and gas industry, focusing in particular on environmental and social performance, ICMM, which is their counterpart for mining and metals, and then you also have a whole range of industry associations for different agricultural commodities, and here, for example, I've used the RSPO, which is focusing on sustainable palm oil. But of course, companies can also make commitments through other platforms, and there are a whole range of cross-sectoral platforms that exist. I've put a couple here, including WBCSD, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And that's a global CEO-led organization of over 200 companies. You also have the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity, which is associated with the CBD process in particular. So it's very closely linked with the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the final one I wanted to outline was Business for Nature. And that's a global coalition that was recently set up and which really aims to capture a whole range of different actors to work towards private sector commitments. So it's not just companies, it's also going to be the other stakeholders that are trying to influence companies which are part of Business for Nature. And you can see from just the excerpt from their website, they say that they have nearly 400 forward-thinking businesses which have already made commitments and are taking action to help reverse nature loss and openly calling for other companies to join them. So those are all actors that have really influence what companies commit to and what companies will adhere to in terms of their practices. And so to sum it all up, what I really wanted to emphasize is that impact assessment legislation and other national legislation are really a key driver of how a company operates in terms of EI processes. The other big influencer is going to be the financial sector and industry associations. And in particular, they have driven the adoption of risk-based approaches, the mitigation hierarchy, and a focus on no net loss or net gain of biodiversity into corporate biodiversity management. And finally, acknowledging that front-runner companies are looking to engage in the global biodiversity agenda, and that can result in tangible commitments from them. And so although at the start, my graph really separated each of those drivers onto corporate biodiversity management, you should really see them as a loop because they all feed into one another. National legislation will feed into practices from the industry, and the global initiatives and agreements will feed into the national legislation or even industry-wide commitments. And so that's really something to keep in mind as you try and influence the private sector, that any research that is produced or put forward to those companies takes elements from those different drivers to really emphasize the message you are trying to get across. I'm going to